Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. Today's episode is a conversation, and I'm speaking with Dr. Shamil Chandaria. I'm very happy to be able to call Shamil a friend. He's an amazing being, not only brilliant, but with a truly great, wide-open heart. And I'm honored to have him on the podcast. I really loved this conversation. I hope you will too. I'll give Shamil a proper introduction by reading some of his extensive biography, which is impressive. He's doing great things in the world, as you'll hear. Dr. Shamil Chandaria is a philanthropist, entrepreneur, technologist, and academic with multidisciplinary research interests spanning computational neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and the philosophy and science of human well-being. His PhD from the London School of Economics was in mathematical modeling of economic systems. Later, he completed an MA in philosophy with distinction from Imperial College London, where he developed an interest in philosophy of science and philosophical issues in neuroscience, ethics, and biology. In 2018, Shamil helped to endow the Global Priorities Institute at Oxford University, an interdisciplinary research institute focusing on the most important issues facing humanity. In 2019, he was a founder of the Center for Psychedelic Research in the Department of Brain Sciences at Imperial College London, a neuroscience research institute investigating psychedelic therapies for a number of conditions, including treatment-resistant depression. He has also funded research on the neuroscience of meditation at Harvard and University of California, Berkeley. And I'm pleased to announce that Shamil has just released a paper co-authored with Ruben Laukkonen, who we also had on the podcast recently. I hope this paper will make a big impact. It's called A Beautiful Loop, an Active Inference Theory of Consciousness. And in this paper, Ruben and Shamil offer a new perspective on how to understand consciousness in a way that makes more sense of our first-person experiences in the realms of altered states, meditation, and so on. You can find the paper on the Psy archive. We'll provide a link. So, exciting times in the study of consciousness as very experienced meditators like Ruben and Shamil are doing deep scientific work as well. And these two worlds are finally starting to truly come together. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Now I bring you Shamil Chandaria. I'm here with Shamil Chandaria. Welcome, Shamil.
Oh, it's great to be on. Thank you.
And you are such a unique human. There are very few people in this world who have the extensive experience in meditation practice that actually results in real altered states of consciousness and actual perceptual shifts that are lasting, right? Which doesn't happen with all meditators, for sure. And at on the other hand, you're deeply involved with the world of neuroscience, consciousness studies, um, and understanding these phenomenological experiences from these two angles, from the inside and from the outside, from the first person and from the third person, quite thoroughly. And as far as I know, maybe there's a few dozen people in the English speaking world anyway who have both of these perspectives so solidly at most. So it's really a great gift to have you on the podcast and to have you share with this audience. And I know they'll be excited to hear what you have to say. And I guess I want to start with what are you most excited about right now in your research and or in your practice in your life? And then later we can get to how you got into all this and so on.
Yeah, great. Well, I think the biggest thing for me is that in our society, we have this growing movement of people having spiritual practices, meditating, and finding real benefit. And more people are awakening and really finding profound benefits from some of these ancient contemplative traditions. And on the other side, we have science, which is incredibly successful. I mean, it's apart from going to the moon and having iPhones, we have mathematical models of quantum physics, which parts of quantum field theory, which can predict the magnetic moment of an electron to 13 decimal places. Okay, I mean, that is just so astounding. And yet, somehow, this spiritual dimension, where people find meaning and understanding in their experience and our scientific worldview seem to be disconnected. And we basically have a kind of cognitive dissonance. In the past, the philosophy of life that people lived in and their spiritual traditions were much more aligned. Today, they couldn't be further apart, and that seems to me a great shame, because there are many people who say, I really feel like there's something to this meditation. There's something to understanding the nature of our consciousness, and how and the nature of our constructed experience, and somehow that really brings meaning and alleviates suffering. And yet, I don't want to be involved with all this woo-woo stuff. Maybe it's based on kind of some sort of magical, mystical stuff. And, I'm a hard-headed kind of person, and I want to not have this fundamental fissure in my cognitive appraisal of the world. And it seems to me that there are real bridges to be made here. And so I guess a big picture from my perspective is like, I've increasingly seen fantastic bridges from especially neuroscience, that connects this whole spiritual dimension with our latest understanding of how the brain works and our latest philosophical kind of pictures of that perspective. So, I guess that's the big thing for me.
Yeah, so it's like in physics, the Holy Grail, right, is a theory of everything, or a unified theory that makes sense of both gravity and quantum phenomena within the same theoretical understanding, which has escaped physicists so far. And it's almost as if that's what we need in these uh, in these phenomenological sciences, if I call them that. That is to say, an understanding that makes sense of what we experience from the first person perspective, which, as you know, can include some extraordinary experiences of states of mind and consciousness that are like almost unimaginable to the average person, and then this third person perspective, the scientific study of what's happening in the brain and so on. And there's usually been a privileging of one over and against the other. And if there was some kind of unified understanding, there wouldn't need to be this privileging. And we see it all the time in the spiritual world, people poo-pooing science, as it were, and then the scientific world, exactly the opposite,
Yeah.
vis-a-vis the spiritual practitioners. So what are the what are the inroads towards this unified understanding? What makes you hopeful that we are advancing towards that unified understanding
Okay.
that
Well,
makes sense of this?
yeah, that's a great setup. So, as you said, there are these two ways of seeing the world. Our first person phenomenological perspective and the third person um, perspective of science, of neurons firing, what's going on in the brain. And there has been this very important gap between these two perspectives. It's called the explanatory gap, which is and it's actually related to a very deep philosophical problem called the hard problem of consciousness.
Mm.
And actually, no one's really been able to make a bridge between this kind of conscious experience and the neural goings on. Now, I would say that in the last 15, 20 years, we are beginning to really have the possibility of a bridge. It's not a direct connection, but it's a third thing that we can introduce. So this is a new area of neuroscience called computational neurophenomenology. And I'll kind of unpack that a little bit, but the computational comes from the fact that we're going to introduce a new part of an understanding, which is neither first person perspective nor third person perspective. It is a computational model of what is going on algorithmically in the brain. And it then gives us bridges to the brain because it's describing the algorithms that are being operationalized in the brain through neural firings, but it also gives us bridges, direct bridges to the first person phenomenology because it specifically talks about the informational content of your first person perspective. It, there are specific homologs of what I experience in this computational model. And even what I'm paying attention to. So, we can start to describe mathematically and in information theoretic terms about our experience. And there are a number of these computational models. A very famous one that has been proposed is called integrated information theory, which is trying to be a general theory of consciousness. But the one I'm most excited about in this computational neurophenomenology is a kind of approach called the free energy approach. It's sometimes called predictive processing or active inference, but it's a kind of paradigm, a new paradigm that's emerged over the last 15 years, 15, 20 years in neuroscience. And it's a kind of, it's looking at what the brain's trying to do. Should I go into how it works a little
Yeah,
bit?
yes, but at first let me just back up a tiny bit because some listeners may not understand the basics here. So I'll just summarize the hard problem in the simplest terms, which of course is the question of why should there be conscious experience at all? Meaning to say, there's nothing in our biology that requires it, like we have incredibly complex and detailed genomes that direct the behavior of the body. and why does there need to be consciousness, right? From a biological point of view, it's a mystery, right? Meaning to say, experience, like an organism could execute its biological program without an experience of something that it's like to be that organism. And so then the question, of course, arises, where, if consciousness has a biological foundation, which of course is an assumption, it's not a proven thing, but if it does have a biological foundation, how and when does consciousness emerge? And so with IIT, for example, that you mentioned, integrated information theory, essentially the argument is that there's a level of complexity in neurological processing that when you pass that threshold of that level of complexity, consciousness appears as an emergent property of the complexity of information processing, in the same way that wetness appears as an emergent property of H2O molecules that don't have the property of wetness in the molecules themselves, but you get enough together and then they slide around in this way that we call wetness. So that's the common way it's summarized. And it seems that, from what I understand, and here's where you need to correct, but IIT has gotten much, much better and is really and has gained respect, but it still hasn't given any evidence that it could penetrate the fundamental mystery of why is there consciousness at all. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean that's I think that's a good summary. I mean, I myself, I'm kind of agnostic on IIT, but I think it's a very good model and foundation. And of course, all of these computational models, we're not actually directly hitting the hard problem. In a sense, we're bypassing the hard problem. In terms of IIT, there is this a sense that, in fact, it might be kind of like a panpsychist theory anyway, because why should it be, as you correctly said, like the fundamental issue and the hard problem is, why should it be like anything for neurons to, when neurons fire in a specific way, in an integrated way, even, why should it be like anything? And that hard problem is still there. So no one's actually going after the hard problem. I mean, that's going to be there. I think, we should sort of set that aside. What the amazing thing is that we can make so much progress now by introducing this new computational neurophenomenological framework, and the specific computational model that we have in mind is a kind of starting from first principles. What is the brain trying to do? And we have all this sensory data that's coming in through our eyes and ears and sensory epithelia across our body, and we have to try to make sense of that. We have to try to figure out what are the causes of our sensory data out there, inverted commas, in the world. Now, there is a kind of mathematically optimal way of using information that's purely derived from theoretical first principles in information theory. It's called Bayesian inference. And Bayesian inference says, roughly speaking, I should sort of probably just at least sketch out what Bayesian inference is, just to make it not sort of magical. But it's something that many people would have come across Bayes' formula at school, and it's a sort of a step up from that. But basically, it relies on Bayes' formula, and what it says is that, look, I've got this sensory data coming in, and what I'm trying to do is figure out the probability that this sensory data, for example, is caused by a tree out there. Okay, so or it could be caused by a car. Now the question is, what is the right inference to be drawn from that data? And the way you actually calculate that from basis formula is you kind of go backwards. What you do is you say, well, okay, like if we assume it's, the way you actually calculate if it's what's the probability that this sensory data is caused by a tree, the way you calculate it is first you do, well, what's the probability that I would get this particular sensory data if it were indeed a tree? So if it were a tree, how likely is this sensory data that I'm getting? That's called the likelihood of the data. So that's the first term. And then I then multiply that with a second term, which is basically how likely are trees in general? What's the prior probability of seeing trees at all? And that way, I can actually calculate the probability that the sensory data is coming from trees.
Yeah,
There is
let me just pause you for a moment, because some people might not understand how fundamental at the very fundamental level that you're talking about, because the thing that's needed here, I think, is just the fact that the brain is, or consciousness, whatever we want to call it, but we are generating our experience of the world, right? So like when you see a tree, in a sense, that's the brain's guess that there is a tree there, right? Because it is the brain that's generating experience, not
right.
disconnected
Well,
from anything.
I was actually going to come to that because
Okay.
we're actually going to, in fact, we're going to derive that.
Okay.
We're
So, but
actually
the data that you're talking about coming in, you say data coming in, but it's a lot of people don't get that data is extremely raw. It's not the data of a tree, it's the
absolutely
data that might be
might be
a
a
tree.
tree. Exactly,
Exactly. Okay,
exactly,
sorry.
exactly. So no, this is exactly right. I mean, um, as you say, the sensory data that we get is incredibly rough and raw. I mean, the example I normally give is if you put your hand straight out uh, in front of you and put your thumb up and look at your thumbnail out there, you see it's a very small area of the visual field.
Hmm.
And that is all you can see in color and accurately. That's the sort of the fovea, the macular region on the retina. And yet, if I look around, I see everything in beautiful color, in cartoonish, with cartoonish definition. It all seems to be like just out there, and that actually couldn't be coming through your eyes because you simply don't get enough sensory data. So that's a hint that, in fact, somehow we're not seeing what's coming through our eyes. This is I'll just hold that thought and we'll come back to it.
Hmm.
Now, in the Bayes formula, I actually just gave these two terms: the likelihood of the data, which
Hmm.
is how likely is this data given that it's a tree, times the prior probability of a tree. Now, there's actually a third term, a normalizing term, a kind of constant that you divide by, which is, roughly speaking, how likely is this sensory data in general? And that kind of makes sure that probabilities add up to one. Now, it turns out that in calculating that normalizing term, that sort of keeps probabilities, you would actually, if you did this formally mathematically, you would have to figure out every single hypothesis that this sensory data could come from. It could come from a tree, it could come from a car, it could come from a human, it could come from an alien spacecraft. In fact, there are an infinite number of hypotheses that it could come. And that clearly cannot be done. That's called, technically, this becomes something called computationally explosive.
Mm-hmm.
And so this algorithm, of course, is, we use the same algorithm in artificial intelligence and machine learning. So both in AI and in evolution, we can't actually compute Bayesian inference directly. So this is absolutely crucial. It's computationally explosive. So in AI and machine learning and evolution had to make a workaround. And actually, we end up using the roughly similar workaround as evolution figured out, and that workaround is called approximate Bayesian inference, sometimes called variational free energy inference. And the way it works is this: you say, well, okay, look, I can't figure out what's going on. I just can't calculate it out. What I'll do is I will, from being a baby, I will slowly train up my neural networks and get more and more ideas of what this thing could be. Um, and let's suppose that I guess that it's a tree. Okay, I guess from my recognition neural networks, I'm guessing that this is a tree. Then what I do is, from that guess, which is been calculated up from my neural networks, I will then simulate what I would expect to see if indeed it was a tree. Okay, and I will simulate it, and then what you then do is you compare the output of that simulation with the rough and ready sensory data that you get, and that gives you a prediction error. And that prediction error, then what you do is you adjust the parameters of your simulation, the knobs and dials of your simulation, the features of your simulation, to minimize that prediction error. So what we're really doing, so it turns out that the way that the brain's working is that we are simulating what we think we're seeing. We're adjusting the simulation to minimize the difference between the output of the simulation and the sensory data. That's called prediction error minimization, or predictive
Right.
processing.
Yeah.
And here's the punchline. The punchline is this. This is what I call the neurophenomenological hypothesis. What we actually experience is not the sensory data coming through. What we actually experience is the internal simulation, is the internal model. So it's a kind of controlled hallucination. And the reason we call it a controlled hallucination is that it's controlled in a way that minimizes prediction error. So it's not any old hallucination. If I had psychosis or schizophrenia and I'm hallucinating, that's kind of an uncontrolled hallucination. It's not minimizing prediction error. It's not trying to find the best simulation to actually make fit with the sensory data that you get. Now, the punchline is this. The punchline is that what we experience is the output of that simulation. So we don't experience the sensory data, we experience the internal model. And that is extremely important. So there is something that most of us have, it's when we look at life, when we look out from our eyes, we think we're actually seeing the world as it is. Right? We really think we're seeing the tree as it is in its own right. But this is called naive realism. So we actually think that there's a real tree and we're actually seeing it. Now, many spiritual traditions have cottoned on to the fact that this couldn't possibly be right. And in the Western philosophical tradition, that understanding amongst philosophers started with Plato in his very, very famous allegory of the cave, where he said, look, we think we're seeing reality, but actually we're just like prisoners chained in an underground cave, and someone behind us, there's a fire behind us, and there's someone who's taking cutout cutout shapes, and we're seeing the sort of flickering images of the real shapes. And then, of course, in his analogy, a prisoner escapes and then actually goes out of the cave and sees reality as it is, and sees the sun for the first time, the real light. And of course, many people interpret that as a mystical experience. But that tradition from Plato 2,500 years ago actually culminates in this fantastic synthesis done by Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century essentially says that, look, we are living in our phenomenal world. The world as we experience it. This phenomenal world is a kind of a construction, and we construct it using certain basic concepts like space and time and causality. And we actually have no true knowledge of the world as it is in itself, the noumenal world. We're only living in our phenomenal world. So both East and West, there is an understanding that, in fact, our experience is a kind of mental construction. And we're beginning to understand how this mental construction works in the brain. And this is a kind of a revolution in neuroscience, because if you ask neuroscientists 20 years ago, how does the brain work? Most people would say, well, there's some data coming in from the bottom of the neural networks, from the sensory data, like eyes, the edges of the visual system and the auditory system, and it goes through these neural networks and processed up, and then eventually we figure out what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out that, in fact, that is exactly upside down. What's actually going on, according to our latest understanding of the computational principles of how the brain's doing this, is that what's really going on is that the brain has got beliefs and priors around what's going on. It makes a simulation. The simulation is quickly adjusted to minimize prediction error. And in fact, the data never goes up the neural networks. The only thing that goes up the neural networks is the prediction errors. This is an amazing thing.
Yeah.
And it makes sense of one very important piece of data, which is it's always been a bit of a mystery why there are about 10 times as many feedback neurons in the brain as feed-forward neurons. And now we understand why, because mostly it's a feedback system.
Brilliant. Okay, so let me just put this in the simple language for those not familiar with these topics. And if I get it wrong, you tell me. So essentially what we're saying, and let's just talk on the level of the brain, and then later we'll relate it to the tantric theory of consciousness. But the brain is producing a simulation. It's as if we are all in the matrix, right? But we have common biology, so we're not all in a separate matrix, But each brain is creating a simulation of reality, and the simulation doesn't need to be accurate. It needs to be functional, right? This is part of what Donald Hoffman brought in, which we can touch on him.
Right.
That the simulation has to keep us alive. It doesn't have to reflect what's actually out there, quote unquote, right? So it's mostly hallucination. It's mostly simulation, and in terms of like what's making it through the gates, right, through the sense gates and into this simulated experience is just the prediction errors, meaning to say, when something that's coming through the senses clearly doesn't fit in the simulation, that's a prediction error.
It's a surprise.
Yeah, only the prediction errors are making it through the gate, and thereby adjusting the simulation. So does that mean, I mean, can we say that, could we put a percentage on it? Could we say your reality is not 98% simulation, or what?
Well,
like, how do we
the thing is,
describe that?
it rather than that, it's a co-creation. I use a Buddhist term of art, which is it's a dependent co-arising. It's a dependent co-arising. So the way we see the world is a kind of a marriage between our view, our beliefs, and the sensory data from the world. So that's the best way to put it. It's a dependent co-arising. So it's neither just an independent simulation, nor is it just the sensory data. For example, and the weighting between the weight of the sensory data and the weight of the priors is actually determined by something called precision weighting. So this is a technical term, and roughly speaking, precision is the inverse of uncertainty or variance or standard deviation. So if you have very, very, very precise data, in other words, you can see very clearly that this is a straight line, you can keep looking at it and you get a lot of sensory evidence for that, it's going to have high precision weighting. And in the dependent co-arising that we talk about, we're going to weight that sensory data very highly, and therefore it can overrule some of the priors. It can actually make sure that your simulation really has to conform with that particular sensory data. So this is the way it is. It's best to think about it as a marriage between the data and your priors, and it's very sophisticated. Now, these precisions is where all the magic is, to be honest. When we talk about, many people will have heard of neuromodulators and neurotransmitters. Neuromodulators like serotonin and noradrenaline and dopamine, they are actually affecting, as when they're working as neuromodulators rather than neurotransmitters, they're actually affecting some of these global precision signals. In other words, they're saying, pay attention. For example, if there's a lot of uncertainty, if I'm getting a lot of prediction error, there might be a release of noradrenaline, norepinephrine in the brain that says there is a lot of prediction error, there's a lot of uncertainty. I'm not sure we have a grip on this. In other words, our priors don't seem to be getting it right. Let's increase the learning rate of what's going on. Let's try to really pay attention and learn from this and update our models. So it's a very, very sophisticated system, and there's one more thing which I guess, there are two more things to really fill out the picture. The first is the self, the sort of who we take ourselves to be, and the second is how rewards and action works into this framework. So let's just do action first, and then we'll come on to the self. But action actually is also integrated into the same framework. The way, for example, let's say, I value an apple. I really want to eat it. It's going to give me some reward value. That's actually handled by saying that the belief is that I will get the apple and eat it. Okay. And the apple's on the other side of the desk. And so that's a prediction error. So I will then minimize that prediction error. But now, instead of adjusting my perception, I'm going to minimize it by doing an action, reaching out my hand onto the desk, picking up the apple and eating it. So you can minimize prediction errors two ways. One is through your perception and one is through your action. And both are in service of survival, as you said, right? This is not about getting things right, inverted commas, whatever that means, whatever standard that is. It's about surviving. So all of these, prediction error minimizations, doing actions and seeing the world in a certain way, is exactly as you said. It's a functional thing. It's like whatever works for us. So that's one thing on action. And then the final thing is, but where am I? Now, the funny thing is that in this in this whole simulation, which ends up being a kind of a world model, let's call it a phenomenal generative world model. So it's coming from the generative model, which is generating the simulation. But we're creating this phenomenal generative world model, and there's a tree, and there's grass, and there's a sky, and there's sounds, and there's smells. But that's really interesting. There's also you. You look down, and there is this avatar of ourselves. And we're also in the simulation, or a representation of us is in the simulation. And within that representation, the brain does a good job of like making sure the internal body sensations are linked within that sensation, within that simulation. And here's the funny thing, and this is the real nub of the problem, which is we take ourselves to be the little avatar in the simulation. And in fact, if you ask people where where are you, where are you conscious from, they think, they say, well, actually, I'm kind of somewhere behind my eyes in this simulation, or if you're from a more traditional culture, you might say I'm from my heart area in this simulation, in
Hmm.
this avatar. But of course, all of this is arising within your own awareness. So that's the state of play.
In other words, the creation of the avatar, which includes not just the perception of a body, but the feeling of a me, right? The creation of the avatar is itself a survival strategy for the biological organism. To have a sense of a me doesn't mean that there is a me. That doesn't mean there is a separate self. It just is something that was adaptive for the
Absolutely,
organism.
absolutely. In fact, it's absolutely crucial to have a representation of the self in the world model, because again, computationally, um, if I'm over here and the tiger is over there to my left, um, I need to figure out where I need to run to escape the tiger, and go over to the right and run up the tree. Now, you can't really do that unless you have where you are in the world model and what's happening to you. It's extremely important for your own survival, or whether something is hurting you. There's a pain, there's a thorn in your leg. So it's extremely important to have an agent model. And this agent model, it's sometimes called the phenomenal self model, includes various parts. There's of course an avatar, but there's also a perspectivity. When we look at the world model, we're looking at it from the viewpoint of essentially like our eyes. We are the coordinate center of our world model. But not just that, but there is a agent model that we think we are doing our actions. We are the conductor or the orchestrator of our actions. We also think we have this narrative story. There's all sorts of parts of this phenomenal self model. A social self, a narrative self, a, an epistemic self, a cognitive agent, a sense of perspectivity. And these are all kind of combined in this magical trick to make us have these wonderful simulations that are conducive to our survival.
Yeah. And to go back for a moment to my overly simplistic question about like what percentage of experience is simulation, and what percentage is derived from the outer world, which will a term will come to problematize here in a bit. You were saying essentially that ratio, whatever it is going to be constantly changing.
Correct.
And it made me think of there's examples of very elderly people who have gone blind, but they don't know that they've gone blind. We're talking about people who are staying in their same house that they've always lived in, and some there are documented cases of these elderly blind people who are having the same visual experience of their house that they always had. I don't know if you've seen these studies. They navigate the space and they're seeing. If you ask them, they say, "Yeah, I see everything." But if you go in there and move the table, they will run into the table because they're only seeing the visual field that their brain has learned to generate of a very familiar environment. And so we know, and there's an example of somebody whose whose simulation is 100% of their experience, at least visually speaking.
Okay, that's a great example. I actually don't know about that. I'm going to check it out now. But certainly a predictive processing explanation of that would be very apposite, because essentially what's happening, this ratio that we talked about, precision weighting. Well, what happened presumably is that the sensory data became very, very noisy until it basically became totally random, or zero, in which case it wasn't very precise, and therefore the precision weighting of the data is very low, and the precision weights normally add up to 100%, right? So, and the
Right.
precision weighting of the priors are very high, and so they're going around essentially just living in their internal simulation, not being adjusted by the data at all, because it's being effectively down weighted in that combination process.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And this also explains why if we encounter some very unfamiliar situation, we do sort of come alive more, and all the senses get more vivid, right? Because we are weighting the data that is not already part of the simulation more strongly, and so we see and hear and feel and sense everything more vividly in this unfamiliar situation. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, meditators may recognize that, after your morning meditation, if you were to take a walk and be in a very mindful state, everything might appear sharp and beautiful and fresh and interesting, and low level sensory percepts are now a part of your visual gestalt, your conscious gestalt. And that's because meditators are able to can learn to effectively upweight or downweight the priors, hold their beliefs lightly,
Yeah.
and therefore the sensory data come up, and therefore the world can feel richer and fresher and full of detail. If
Well,
it's
oh, this is great. So, in other words, because there's a ratio always in operation, if you learn how to downweight your priors, your assumptions about the nature of reality, then automatically the everything else upweights.
Yeah, exactly. And here's the interesting thing. So we talked about meditators, but look at the other side of it. If one of the very interesting things about depression is that there is an overactive part of, well, sort of the central part of the brain that carries a lot of these top level priors is thought to be an area of the brain called the default mode network.
Hmm.
Now, what we see in depressed patients is that there is a more activity in the default mode network relative to the sensory cortices sort of at the edge of the brain, which is receiving the data. Now,
Hmm.
this suppression of the sensory cortices in depressed people is like the signature. And so when a depressed person says, Doc, like the world just seems gray to me,
Mm.
that may not be an analogy, it may not just be a metaphor. It may
Right.
literally be that they are just so trapped in their own stories, their own top level
Mm.
belief structures, often which can include those top level belief structures we talked about, priors and visual priors. But the highest level priors might be kind of top level beliefs like, the world's a terrible place, I'm a
Yeah.
useless person, and everything always goes wrong. And then of course, if you have that prior and you look out at the world and see what's the probability of the sensory data given that prior, you say, well, yeah, you see, the glass is half full, it's just terrible. um, so yeah, it's a very, very interesting thing. We see this balance being shifted.
Okay, so based on direct experience, I would say it must be the case that it goes the other way as well, meaning to say, if through mindfulness practice you learn to upweight the sensory data, just the qualia of
Yeah.
experience, which it seems so insignificant when you're trapped in the mind world, right? But you bring more and more attention to just the feeling of the body, the direct sensations, more attention to the colors and sounds and all the sensual field. That will somehow automatically start to downweight the priors. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. So obviously, it makes it sound like there's a sort of two-level system. Actually, it's a hierarchical system, and there's could be something like a half a dozen layers in this hierarchy.
Yeah.
So priors at one level, at the top level models, are influencing the models below, and then those models are influencing the models below that. So there's a whole hierarchy, and as you say, somewhere near the bottom of that hierarchy is somatosensory information, sort of body sensations and basic vibratory sounds and feelings and things like that. And if we learn to pay attention to low-level phenomena like body sensations, like the breath of the nose, like um, the details of the visual system or taste, we are effectively taking, enriching that aspect of, we are shifting our conscious perception to heavily upweight these low level sensory percepts. Now,
Right.
as you say, like, the important thing is it reduces the impact of the top level belief structure, the top level priors, but that is very important for several reasons. Our basic habits of the world, seeing the world, are encoded in these top level priors, like the world's a rubbish place and I'm a useless person, or however we kind of typically see the world.
Hmm.
Now, if we start downweighting that way of looking at the world and looking at the world much in a much fresher way, without a lot of weight of preconceived beliefs, well, not only could we become more creative and open minded, but it does something else, which it allows us to start forming new priors. Because if you look at the world afresh and say, without my usual preconception that the world's a terrible place, and just look at the world and the fine variegated detail of the texture of the bark and the shimmer of the colors, um, suddenly, as your priors are downweighted, and you look at and you reflect upon this experience, you can say, well, actually, the world's a pretty amazing place. And that then gives you a new belief structure. The posterior, the generated experience, then contradicts the prior, and then that downweights that new prior. So you get what's called well, you get learning of the prior. So you start to be able to shift or extinguish old priors and have fresh ones that are more helpful for your survival, perhaps. Certainly a better than having a depressed prior. And this is very important, I would say. We'll get on this later, I guess, in the liberation part of the journey. There's sort of the awakening part, but there's this liberation part where we start to extinguish a lot of priors that are no longer helpful, aka samskaras and karmas and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I'm also reminded of a case that Oliver Sacks studied in one of his books. He talks about this case where a fellow took some cocktail of recreational drugs, some unusual combination, which he couldn't even remember later what it was. But somehow this cocktail of drugs was such that when he woke up the next morning, all his perceptual priors were so heavily downweighted. Sachs didn't have this language at the time, but this is clearly what happened because this guy looks around and the world is just unbelievably vivid. And not only vivid, he said where he used to see one color brown, just that's brown, he saw, at least a dozen or 2 dozen shades where he would have just seen one shade before. And he is like, oh, this is crazy, what's happening to me? And he went to the doctor's office, and he said, his nose, his olfactory sense was like a dog's. Like he could close his eyes and smell the unique smell of each person in the room without even getting close to them. Right? Just this
Wow.
extraordinary case, and it wore off after a while. But where the brain's capability for this depth of sensual experience got unlocked through this kind of
Yeah.
radical depressing of the perceptual
Yeah.
priors.
Well, it's very, that's amazing. I mean, in fact, psychedelics actually end up with, one of the leading theories that I was involved with Robin Carhart Harris and Carl Friston. It was something called the Rebus model of how psychedelics work. And basically, we think that the mechanism through of action from an algorithmic perspective is precisely to downweight these top level priors, allow you to see the world afresh. And without these constrained top level priors, mid level priors and low level priors actually take over. So, that's why you see geometrical shapes, because those are much more sort of mid level, low level priors. Mid level priors might be clouds. So you might see clouds, you might see faces in clouds and things like that. So, so
Yeah.
you get exactly the same effect with psychedelics.
Yeah, in other words, as Bernardo Kastrup argues, psychedelics are actually reducing brain function in a way, like reducing the ordinary brain function, not across the board, sufficiently that this extremely not only vivid but fluid experience, because and even without taking psychedelics, this can happen from a breakthrough in meditation where you perceive the world as being somehow much more fluid, like whether it is in your visual perception or it's just a feeling. It's as if before there were static objects just sitting there, right? And now in this mode of perception, like everything is profoundly fluid and is flowing into each other with no hard boundaries, with no fixed static entities at all, because undoubtedly reality is actually like that, and more of it's getting through due to the psychedelic or the meditative breakthrough.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a really good example that um, there's a kind of a hyper prior, a top level prior, that there are permanent objects and that things are kind of impermanent, and through meditation you can actually start to weaken these priors, and you get essentially what the this impermanence. Your whole visual field can start to shimmer and vibrate, because of course what you're doing is you're no longer imposing that things are supposed to be static, and
Right.
the brain is kind of a noisy place, and so of course in a sense things are it's more closer to the lower levels of the hierarchy that things are shimmering, because these are all approximations.
Yeah,
And even the separation of object and background subject is a kind of a prior. So there are
absolutely.
all of these effects.
So let's come to how this ties into tantric philosophy. So there's a couple things there. One, what's the status of external objects? So I think you are going to agree with what I'm about to say, but let's try it. Um, this whole explanation you gave, which was brilliant, of how predictive processing works, was like, oh, what is the likelihood that the data that's coming in is consistent with there being a tree there? Now, this way of talking is a good way of explaining the model, but it need not necessarily suggest that there are actually things called trees. Because what's actually, okay, to put it from a tantric point of view, it's like some tantric masters argued all that really exists is waves of energy. There's nothing but waves of energy. Now, in other words, waves of energy, when they interact, they create patterns, they create interference patterns, which can be enormously complex depending on how many waves are interacting, right? And so, according to this view, we might say what's really out there is nothing but waves of energy combining and recombining endlessly in interference patterns. And that's what we are using to construct our experience, right? So, but when we say, is there really a tree there? What's the likelihood of a tree given the data that's coming in? We're not arguing, you're not arguing, right, for an external world in which there are trees, but rather if we relate to that particular energy pattern as a tree, then it's adaptive, it's functional,
Right.
we survive, and that's all we need to know from the point of view of the simulation. Is that right?
Yeah, I would even go further, actually. Um, we don't have to assume anything about the external world. Um, the only thing, we're kind of playing a game as a living organism, which is there is sensory data. If I react to it in a certain way, I survive by eating the apple and escaping the tiger. That's all there is. Now,
But you're not
what?
saying there's actually apples and tigers.
No, that's on our phenomenal world. That's the language of our model of our phenomenal world.
Right.
I'm not saying anything about the external reality. You see, the thing is, we split up. We create representations. Representations, of course, is not a good word because it sounds like it's representing. Actually, it's
Mm.
probably closer to say that when we talk about representations, we're actually just presenting a kind of a date, as Donald Hoffman would put it, a kind of UI, user interface, that is helpful
Right.
for our survival. What that relates to in terms of the electrons and the circuitry, gosh, it's probably got nothing to, there's probably no circuitry that's in the shape of a waste paper basket that's there on your desktop, right? So we can really be radically quiet about the external world. All that there is that there is data. Now, there are some things that we can say about the external world. Science works by essentially, we have sensory data. Even if we look at dials in scientific instruments, that's just sensory data. And science is kind of a very brilliant way of predicting our sensory data. So, we're always inside our phenomenal model. People think science is about the noumenal world, the world as it is actually out there, but it's really about our representation of that world.
Of course,
Um,
yeah.
and so now we can be very, now you could be a kind of a naive realist to say, yeah, there really are kind of like trees out there and stuff like that. Or you could be a radical idealist, saying, no, it's just sort of mind at large out there. Or you could be a neutral monist, saying it's neither mind nor matter. Or you could say, look, it's some quantum soup of networks of a graph theory of quantum states or something that's out there. Or you could say that actually we are co-creating reality with some quantum fields. All of that is compatible with this approach. We are being entirely silent. I would say that this is very metaphysically humble.
Yeah. And this is what something I want the listeners to understand, because a lot of people think that science has basically worked it all out. I mean, it's a misunderstanding, because physicists say, like, we have a standard model and it works, and it does work for most things. But to say it works just means that it makes sense of the movements of fundamental particles and forces in such a way that they can be predicted, right?
Right.
But none of that gets us to the very bottom, gets us to the root of reality whatsoever. So it's wonderful for especially meditators and spiritual practitioners to know that the mystery is still untouched. It might always be untouched of, like,
Yeah.
what
Right.
actually is reality. To analyze subatomic particles and give them names and call it matter, call all those particles matter, doesn't tell us what matter actually is, and indeed nobody
Yeah.
knows.
Well, I would say that, um, particles, electrons, quarks are just models, are simply models that we make.
Yeah,
Those
mental
models,
models.
yeah, they're models that we make, and they're useful models. Why? Because they allow us to predict sensory data. I mentioned that we can predict through quantum electrodynamics. We can predict the magnetic moment of an electron, the anomalous moment of an electron, to 13 decimal places. What in the end, someone is looking at a computer screen or a dial or something to say, well, some numbers appear, or some dial moves up, the screen. And so ultimately, it's all cashed out in our phenomenal world, right? It's all cashed out through what we can experience. We can experience numbers on a computer screen. and
Yeah.
and so this is the thing. However, I would say it is a shockingly, amazingly damn good model so far, and it allows us to get things like iPhones. So one of the things that we
For better
say,
and for worse.
right, and I better say Android phones as well, right? And for so what it means is that it's pragmatically good. In other words, you know, in a sense, philosophically, I think that this whole approach has a lot in common with pragmatic philosophy, which is representations that allow us to survive are good representations. Um, and some of our scientific models allow us to survive and go to the moon, and therefore they're useful representations. So good or useful representations are ones that predict sensory data, that allow us to survive, that are economical and parsimonious. So this is Occam's razor.
Hmm.
And that cohere with a lot of other beliefs. In other words, we normally have a web of self-reinforcing beliefs and structures, and that gives us confidence that we're on the right path. So these are norms of what make good representations and good stories and good priors and good beliefs, and all of them are compatible with multiple metaphysical views. So I think you can sort of separate that out. And in any case, the other thing I would say is that, and I kind of say this almost to be provocative to your sort of your audience, which is a lot of spiritual
Hmm.
seekers, think that,
Hmm.
well, materialism, this is some crazy ridiculous thing. How could that's clearly wrong, because I've experienced the world and it's kind of made of consciousness. Well, yes, your experience is indeed made of consciousness. Congratulations, you've started to wake up to your generative model. You started to wake up to the fact that, in fact, this is all a mental construction. But it doesn't yet tell you anything about the nature of ultimate reality. And then further to say that most people's idea of physicalism, I mean, I'm not a physicalist, but most people's idea of physicalism, or what used to be called materialism, is some sort of impoverished 19th century view of what materialism was, billiard balls banging into each other. But, physicalism is roughly the thesis of like, that reality is something like what our deepest physics is pointing to. But our deepest physics is pointing to, well, we don't know what. We don't know what these models, which are electrons and quarks, are made of. If they're made of anything, it's kind of mathematics. And so it's pretty much as mysterious. Physicalism is, in
Yeah.
fact, just as mysterious as any other kind of metaphysics.
And this comes to the notion of reality as being fundamentally information, like pure code, which is also in the tantric tradition. Remember, I think I told you this before, that the theory in Tantra that we can understand reality as permutations of matrika, of a fundamental matrix that is information, actually.
Right. Well, okay. So first of all, I'm going to do the interesting thing and push back against that as well.
Great.
Of course, I am deeply like information theory is like at the core of what I think is useful. But I would say rather, I think information is a very good lens, but I would rather say that information is yet another lens to look at reality with. If you like, information supervenes on reality. I'll explain that term because it's a technical philosophical term. When some macro layer supervenes on a subvenient layer, on a micro layer, what it means is that there can't be any change in this macroscopic or supervenient property unless there's a change in the microscopic underlying subvenient properties. So what that means technically is that there is ultimate reality. Let's be entirely neutral about what that ultimate reality is. One lens that we can look at is that it carries information. For example, to use your example of that it's sort of waves of energy or patterns of energy. There are patterns of energy, and if we look at those energetic patterns in a certain way, we can see that information is being conveyed by those patterns.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not right to say that those patterns themselves are made of information, because that's a little bit like saying something like this, that this cat has a smile, and just like this famous Cheshire cat who disappeared and the smile remained, it which is ridiculous. It can't be that the matter the energy waves disappear and that just the information is there. The information is a kind of a description about the patterns that are there. Because information essentially, it's worth saying this, because information is essentially you can make a distinct, if you have distinctions like heads or tails, okay, and you're told it's heads, then you have one bit of information. But the categorization of ultimate reality into heads and tails is a kind of an arbitrary matter. So if you have patterns of energy, like let's just say ultimate reality is kind of like, the surface of an ocean, waves and ripples on ripples and ripples on ripples and ripples. And we say, well, there's information in the waves, but we could be thinking about waves that are roughly 1 meter high and things like that. We could not be thinking about the little ripples, and there's, of course, information in that as well. And it depends on which scales you're looking at. So I think information is a fantastic way of looking at reality. It's just that I don't think it's primitive, fundamental.
Yeah, I mean, it depends how you're defining it, right? Because I think my sense, we can't know for sure, but my sense of what the tantric masters were saying is that when they're talking about reality as fundamentally code or information, and when they're talking about reality as fundamentally waves of energy interacting with each other, that they're saying the same thing, that it's that those aren't two different competitors for the ontological primitive, right? But they're just different ways of talking about that that which is flows, it flows in patterned ways, it flows in and onto itself in patterned ways, and those patterns could be describable in terms of information, but that's not to say that
Right.
they need to be. Right.
Yeah, brilliant. I exactly. And I think that actually they're just, sounds like they're describing something that is very, very deep, in a sense that if you can imagine, let's just take that analogy of waves on the sea, water. In a sense, we impose the patterning onto the sea surface. We call certain big things waves, and certain little things ripples, and certain other things froth. And they're sort of conventional ways. And then we can do information theory on that. But in a way, there is just this sea surface, just rippling with energy, and then the rest is happening in our phenomenal world.
Yeah, the conscious experience of it is as pattern, but it's not to say that even that is the absolute fundamental, right? The ontological primitive. In other words, we don't need to posit an ontological primitive, and if we did, it would probably always be speculative, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
okay, so let's go from there to this one more important thing, which is the brain. This is maybe, I mean, it's something I've been thinking about because, like the other day, Ruben was sort of arguing it doesn't really matter if you say physicalism or idealism, because in the sense that the ontological primitive is beyond conception anyway. So what do you call it? But there is this issue of supervening, as you say, like that does matter for our understanding of reality. So just to make sure I've got the term right, if we say um mental events supervene upon physical ones, that would mean that a change in physical reality is going to consequently have a change in mental reality,
or,
and that there
or
couldn't be a change in mental reality without a change in physical reality. Is that right?
Well, the last bit of the sentence that you said is right, which is that there can't be a change in mental state without there being a change in the physical state. If mental supervenes on physical, then there can be no mental changes without there being an underlying physical change. But there can be
Right.
physical changes without there being mental changes. For example, physical changes far away that make no difference to your mental state.
Okay. Okay. So,
But yeah, I mean, I can see. Yeah, sorry, you're making a point.
well, just coming to this issue of the brain, because even if we're, talking about these theories of how experience is constructed, and the IIT component and the controlled hallucination and the predictive processing and all this, we're not asserting, you aren't, right, and any reasonable person is, they're not asserting that the brain is making experience, that the brain is what's fundamental, because just as we previously said, that there's not necessarily apples or tigers, there's also not necessarily actually brains. Like the way Bernardo puts it, which I love, is he says, like, the brain and the activity of the brain, all the neurological activity of the brain, is simply what conscious experience looks like from a third person perspective. In other words, to tie it into Hoffman as well, the brain is, in a way, like the desktop icon for a vantage point of conscious experience that we call a human being, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
therefore, great.
Yeah,
so
so
so then, go ahead.
yeah, I was just going to say that you know everything, all distinctions, all representations, all ideas are all in our phenomenal world. So you know we see brains, and this is all a part of our representational structure. The real thing that I think you're hinting at is to say no neuroscience or no science actually gives credence to increases the probability that physicalism is right. Um, and I think that is absolutely true. So nothing in science says anything about the metaphysical view that physicalism is right. And arguments for ontological positions like physicalism or idealism or neutral monism or dualism actually have to come from more first principled approaches. And there are good arguments, decent arguments, for why idealism is right. The basic argument is that, well, the one thing we have is our experience, and we know that that's kind of conscious. And so if we're just applying Occam's razor and say that the one thing we know about ultimate reality is that it can produce an experience, then, and that we don't know anything else, then from Occam's razor perspective, you can say, well, that's the ultimate nature of reality. So I think it's a good argument. I mean, it's normally coupled with another. Yeah, go ahead.
That you're sort of thinking of Bernardo's argument here, right? That not that it's only his, but that
Yeah, it goes back much further, I guess.
we know, yeah, just as fundamentally the argument being like we know mind is, however we define it, mind that is to say conscious experience is, right, and it's assembled, structured in some way by what we can call mind. And why should we suppose that there's anything but mind, lacking any evidence for anything but mind, which is absolutely true, of course. So he's positing that what's beyond mind, what's beyond individual mind, is just more mind, right?
Yeah.
And that there's mind at large, which is simply consciousness that is not particularized into the vantage point that we call embodiment. Embodiment just being consciousness contracted into a locus, into a vantage point of perception, right? And that's the thing, is like this is what essentially what non-dual tantra is saying, right? That
Yeah.
and they're using this theological metaphor. You can treat it as a metaphor or something a little bit more than a metaphor, that everything is Shiva, everything is the mind of Shiva, or the consciousness of Shiva, and then Shiva contracts into these individual vantage points, which are never anything but that same one, but perceiving from a particular perspective with apparent limitations, self-imposed limitations. So everything, even limitation, is expressing the radical autonomy, the radical freedom of this one being, this one consciousness that we could call Shiva, right? So, and what I was hoping that the listeners would get is that that view is perfectly compatible with everything we've been saying, but also we can't cling too tightly to that view just because we like it. Oh, it's the tantric view. The tantric masters were ultimate enlightened beings or whatever, so it must be true. Because there's never a way to prove, it seems to me, there's never a way to prove any ontological primitive. You can't actually prove that consciousness is what's fundamental and that everything supervenes on consciousness.
Right.
And you can say that certain mystical experiences contribute to that sort of view, right? I think that the tantric masters held that view because of their spiritual experiences, right? But
Right.
that doesn't mean we could prove it as an absolute.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is very nicely put, but there is something that we can actually gesture towards, which I think really gets at the heart of mysticism and the tantric view, which is monism. So the metaphysical positions generally can be monist, that there is only one ultimate reality, one substance, or dualist, or animist, even more than one, two. And and dualism has a fundamental problem, which is that if there are two types of reality, for example, physical and matter and mind,
Mm.
how would they ever interact? You really have a problem of bridging. And that was a problem for Descartes, and it's still the fundamental problem for dualism. I would argue that the the basic mystical insight is an insight into monism. There is only one ultimate reality. And it is very helpful and a nice example to explain what we mean by that by saying, for example, it could be all a universal mind, which we'll call God. That's a good example. It's a really nice one. But if we're trying to be as philosophically, as epistemologically humble as possible, we could say that what we know is that there is just a monism. We don't, let's be humble to say, actually, even consciousness is an appearance to us. So let's say that there is this, let's just call it ultimate reality. There is only one thing, ultimate reality. It's kind of indeterminate. However, what we know is that information supervenes on this ultimate reality. What we know is that we can have an experience, of a conscious experience, and this one ultimate reality just patterns in on itself and creates these wonderful forms. And this kind of metaphysical view, which is sometimes can be called well, it can sometimes be called neutral monism, and some people don't like it because they think it's not as parsimonious as physicalism or idealism. But it's the view that someone like Spinoza held,
Mm.
and he called this ultimate reality. He had a word for it, and it was Deus sive natura, God or nature. And so it's very interesting because I think it kind of accords quite well with the tantric view, which is that really there is just this one reality, and it is the entirety of the immanent, but it is also, what is called God. Now,
It's ineffably more than the totality of the immanent. That is to say, all that is instantiated doesn't exhaust the
exactly this
all that it is. Yeah.
brilliant. So this is exactly what I was going to come to. That Spinoza view is a pantheist view, which is God is everything. But I think that the tantric view, as you just described it, goes a step further, which is that is panentheist, which is
Yeah.
that everything is in God. So whatever this ultimate reality is, the immanent world is just a part of that. Is everything is in that, or is of that, and that sort of that's I think an important distinction. But it still can be essentially you can still take a very ontologically humble view and just say, let's just call it ultimate reality. I mean, if you can call
Yes.
it God or
But let's come then to the most, what I think is the most beautiful mystery of all, because you've had this experience. I think I've had this experience, and the tantric masters talk about this experience, namely a kind of shift whereby you're experiencing what people might call oneness, but in this very specific way that, if we try to put it into words, it's as if everything tastes like God. Or if your background is Buddhism, you might say everything tastes like Buddha nature. So it doesn't matter the term that we're using, right? But But this actual experience that everything tastes like God. And then if someone were to ask you, when you're in that mode of perceiving, oh, do you mean that you've lost diversity of experience? It's become homogenous? Say, no, 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 no. Like every different flavor is distinctly itself, but it's all God. Like every flavor is a flavor of God
Yeah,
somehow.
yeah,
And this
yeah.
is, of course, you can't get it across in words. Somebody would need to experience this for themselves, right? The tantric tradition calls it samarasa.
Mm.
Samarasa, everything has the taste
One,
of
yeah,
God,
Samarasa, one taste
one
kind of thing.
taste.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
then there's a further thing, which is the abstract noun samarasya, which is the perception that the monism, it's not just a monism, it's not just everything, there's one thing, it's that everything hangs together. Everything hangs together and everything is an expression of, in a way, everything else. Like the tree is what you are expressing as tree, but from the tree's point of view, a human is just what it is expressing in that way, and everything hangs together. This is the samarasya, the sort of mystical fusion. Okay, so the point I'm coming to, this is what I want you to comment on, is we can't say that the absolute reality, whatever it is neutral or somehow completely indefinable, because we have this experience, the samarasa experience, and it's not neutral. It's something totally, it's indescribable, but there's all these flavors are flavors of God or Buddha nature, whatever that term is pointing to is real, or else there wouldn't be that experience possible that is attested across cultures, across centuries. So, what do you think about that?
right. I love it. So, let's unpack this slowly. I think the place to really start is again with the sea. So there is so initially, we perceive the sea and we just see waves, like, oh, that's a tree. This kind of a wave is a tree, and that kind of a wave is a person. So we take these real objects, like there are these specific waves, and then we, for the first time, we relax out of that view and we see that actually there is this vast ocean that is there in which all these waves are arising. Okay, wow. And that's a kind of, people call it the ground of being or something like that. And then something else happens, which is what we see, but the waves, that, that these waves are arising in this vast ocean. But then we see, well, the waves actually are also made of water. They're nothing but the sea. They're also made of water. And then there is just this final view in which it's all just water, all just one taste. But that does not mean it's a flat sea. In fact, because there's energy cascading around the sea, there are forms which are just made of water. There's just Shakti dancing on the, on this ocean. There are waves that are made of water, so they have this distinctive forms which come and go, but it's all made of this same water. And I think that that's a good analogy. That water, you don't have to identify it as pure consciousness or prakasha. You could just say reality or God or anything like that. Now, then what is that taste? And this is obviously, people come up with different words and different narratives. And the one thing I'll say before I say about anything about the taste is that any narrative is like the story of the blind man and the elephant, which is that, you are going to be describing the elephant, you're going to be describing, you've got your blindfolds on, so you could be describing the leg and you could say it's like a tree trunk, and someone else is describing the side of the elephant and it's like a wall. Someone else is describing the trunk and it says like a snake, or the tail is like a rope, etc. And so we've got these partial perspectives on this ultimate reality, and people can say it's like pure being, pure awareness, it's ananda, it's pure bliss, it's love and bliss, it's equanimity, it's peace, or it's boundless freedom, boundless possibility, infinite possibility in nothingness. You know, there are many beautiful ways of tuning into the mystical. And all of these are attempts to narrativize, re-wave the sea, but the sea won't admit the description of a sea. Waves are the wrong category to describe the sea, but we are trying to do it anyway.
Yeah, and the thing that always bothers me about the story of the blind man and the elephant is that it can be used, and is used by some, to justify relativism, which I know
Right.
you don't mean.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that, like, whether or not we could ever cognize the whole elephant, there is a whole elephant. That's like an important element of the story, right?
Yeah.
There's a whole
Yeah.
elephant that is potentially cognizable, maybe not by humans, I don't know, but it's not just about the way that the story is taken in a facile interpretation.
Okay, yeah. This is important. So let me come back on that relativism thing, because I think that's a very, very fair point that you raise, and then I'll come back to why, in principle, you can never describe the elephant, and it's to do with the it's trying to use Shakti to describe Shiva, essentially, which is the wrong way to do it.
Hmm.
And so you're absolutely right. You know, if you go back 200 years in the, you know, scientific revolution and the period of the Enlightenment, the basic idea was that of truth. That, you know, we're trying to find some objective truth, the way things really are. And then coming into the 20th century, there was this major shift in philosophy, especially in the European continent, on where there was this idea of, well, that modernist idea of fundamental truth is wrong, and we should be kind of postmodern and say it's all just narratives, it's all just stories. But that has the specter of relativism, as you say, that any story about the elephant is just good enough, right? Even a pretty awful, rubbish story is good enough. Now, we then, during the late 20th century and up to now, we've realized that no, there kind of needs to be this Hegelian dialectic between the modernist view, the postmodernist view, and now we come to a metamodern view, which
Hmm.
is a kind of a synthesis between the modernist and postmodernist view. And this metamodernism has, I mean, it's going to sound funny, it has irony at the center of its view, which is there are just stories, but some stories are better than other stories. But now we come to the nub. The criterion for better stories are yet other stories. Now, that might sound like, okay, well, that doesn't sound very good. But for example, let me give you the criteria for good stories, for example, that many people might agree on. Stories, narratives, or beliefs, in another word for stories, beliefs that cohere with other beliefs are good beliefs. In other words, if you have this massive, coherent, self-reinforcing web of beliefs, which all cohere, well, when something coheres with that massive web, it's a criterion in favor of that story. Another criterion for a good story is that if this is a good story or good narrative if it helps me predict my sensory data. In other words, if it has empirical value, then you've got the whole of science. A third criteria is uh, if you if it's economical and parsimonious story. If it doesn't include all sorts of extra things that are not necessary for the story. So if it's simple and a very simple story to explain a wide range of phenomena, that's a good story. Another one is that it's a story that allows us to survive. It has pragmatic value. So there are all these decent ways of couching, but what I've just told you is yet another story. In other words, so when we come back to the elephant and the blind man, what it says is that, yeah, there is just the partial descriptions of this elephant, or just, trying to use waves to describe the sea, which is never really going to work. But some some stories are actually really good. They can be conducive to human flourishing. They can allow us to survive. They can cohere with a lot of other beliefs, like science, with science. They can be very economical and parsimonious, Occam's razor. They can be just very neat. So, for example, the story that I told you around the phenomenal generative model constructed in the brain, which is an internal simulation, which explains all of this neuroscience data now, and explains kind of how we end up awakening from our state in the matrix. We awaken into our phenomenal generative world model. We become lucid within our phenomenal generative world model. This is a very economical story.
Yeah. So this, as you probably know, this ties in beautifully with Abhinavagupta's teaching, right, where he's saying you can't throw out stories like we are compulsively storytelling creatures. And so he says what you need to do is called, in Sanskrit, vikalpa samskara, refining and refining and refining the story, the conceptualization, until it becomes what he calls shuddha vikalpa, a perfected conceptualization. Not that it can actually be perfect, but it's just a term of art, right? And what is it that makes it a shuddha vikalpa? What is it that makes it a highly refined or perfected conceptualization? It's that it aligns with the deeper nature of reality, which is fundamentally unknowable. And how do you know it aligns? Because it uh, uh, produces in the one who has this refined conceptualization that state which we subjectively experience to be our most natural state, a state of freedom, a state of openness, a state of willingness to be with and meet reality as it is, a state of lack of any separate self, no need to have a center to experience. And all of this, and more words could be said about it, but it for the one who experiences that shift into that mode of being, it absolutely feels like this is our natural state, and you couldn't convince them otherwise. But of course, from the point of view of discourse, you would have to say it's just a story being validated by another story. But for the one who undergoes the shift, like Abhinavagupta says, you could theoretically go from Shuddha Vikalpa to Nirvikalpa, not as the other schools use that term, but here the term just meaning free from the need for story. But you couldn't jump there. You had to get there through refining your story. And then you land in this freedom from the need for story, which is another way of saying you just don't know, and you don't need to know. Like everything that you need to know is in the body, like how to survive it, the body knows,
I
and then the mental space becomes this sky-like space, it's said, this pure sky of awareness, because you know that you don't know, and you no longer need to know, so there's no problem. And some rare people apparently magically do jump there, but but Abhinavgupta's advice, I think, is good for most of us, that there must be refinement of understanding, and that's the path in a way.
I I really love that. Actually, I really love that. So let me reflect that back in my language, which is, I think this is saying, well, actually, there is a kind of way, a criterion for what is a good narrative, and that is if it's a pointing out instruction that is so good, pragmatically effective, that it points you to a direct realization of the elephant, of the sea. In other words, this famous Zen story of pointing to the moon, you
Mm.
know, it's a good pointer if actually you end up getting an experience of the moon rather than just the finger. And I love that, because in a way it's sort of jumps out of its own framework.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, I also love that, because I often say that good stories are beautiful stories, but I also wonder, like, what do I mean by beautiful? But there is this sense.
It satisfies, a beautiful story satisfies something deep inside us, right? And this is, should the vikalpa could be translated as beautiful story too,
Right,
right?
right, lovely.
But there is something past that, as you say, that's not. The thing is, if you're apprehending it, which is not even an it, of course, then you couldn't really say anything about it. It's to I mean, you could try, right? But you can't say anything about what it is, what reality is. Um, but you could say that this uh, story-free perspective feels like unbounded freedom, but it not only feels like unbounded freedom in, for oneself or in oneself. It feels like everything is unbounded freedom when seen without the need to fit it into any conceptual framework or narrativize it in any way. Like, you still can narrativize it, but you don't feel the need to.
Yeah, yeah,
And so that it's, yeah, it becomes ineffable. But then we still need our stories. It's like, if you experience the whole elephant in this ineffable way, then when you come into the realm of language, you can only ever talk about its trunk or its tail or its leg or its ear.
yeah. I Beautiful. I love that. That's so lovely. And let me just continue to say that, like, you know, so there's one reaction that says, well, then the best thing is to be silent. But actually, I think, no, no, no. Let's make beautiful stories. Just like Rumi wanted to write poetry, because, in fact, telling beautiful stories is precisely the creative expression of the infinite possibility space of the absolute. So, in fact, it would be kind of a shame to just say silent and say that's the best approximation of the absolute, when a better thing is just to be a particular instantiation of a beautiful flower. So my thing that I've been saying most recently is just let 1,000 flowers bloom. Each flower is just this unique expression of the um, infinite potential of the absolute. And we'll, just let 1,000 flowers bloom, and they'll be beautiful ones.
Yeah, and something that people don't get until they do is that each flower is somehow the whole. Like, it is a part, but it's also the whole. like each of us, we're not just part of God, we're the whole. Like you can experientially realize that. Again, it's ineffable. You couldn't explain it. But so there's this, it's sort of like a hologram works, I guess, because there's a part, but the part contains the whole.
Yeah. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
that's why it's like you want the 1,000 flowers to bloom, because each is unique, and yet each is an expression of the one, perfectly unto itself, lacking nothing.
Yeah, beautifully put. Yeah, beautifully put. And yeah, I can't add anything. That's great.
Well, let's wrap it up there, and we can always talk more. It's always a joy to talk with you, on or off the mic, and we can always talk more. And I'm sure that people's response to the episode will be strong enough to indicate that as well.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for everything, and let's keep in touch, please. I value this connection so much.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's been great. Thank you. And it's just amazing work that you're doing. I love it. I love your written work. I love the podcasts. I love your teaching instructions. I think it's fabulous. So thank you for doing what you do.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay. I'll be in touch, Shamil.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga, guided meditation, and much, much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Anne Leader. Find her at anneleader.com. Podcast produced by Grazia Tribulato. New episodes drop every week, and may all beings benefit.